this video, I will be demonstrating the steps for making the hand-sewn pincushion, which is our first project grade. If you have practiced your backstitch, then you should be ready to try it on an actual project. If you haven't sent me a picture or video of your practice backstitch, I need to see that before you start your project so that I can make sure you're doing the stitch correctly. One thing I have realized from some of the other videos and pictures I've received so far, it's really difficult to tell scale from just a picture. So if you could put something in the picture, whether that be a coin or you can put an actual ruler, but something so I can judge, especially the length of your stitches. So for your pincushion, you can do any shape you want. Squares, rectangles, triangles tend to be the most successful in the past, but you really can do any shape you want. Regardless of the shape, you don't want something that's bigger than 3.5, 4 inches. Any bigger than that and you'll have so much stitching to do that it's going to take you a really long time. Plus, a pincushion is generally fairly small, so you really don't need anything bigger than that. You don't want to go too small. Anything smaller than 3 inches is probably too small. By the time you put your stitches in, which will be set inside of the edge a little bit, what you have left will be so tiny, it'll be almost impossible to work with. One other thing to consider when you're putting your fabric together, getting ready to start sewing, I was using a plain fabric. If you're using something with a design, something that has a definite right side and wrong side, the right side is the colored or patterned side, the wrong side is the side that we don't want to show when we're finished. When we're making our pincushions or any of our other projects, we want to be sure that our right sides are touching. In other words, the two colored sides of the fabric, printed sides, are on the inside touching each other. So this inside here would be the colored part that we want to show when we're done. Because after we've sewn this, we're going to turn it right side out. That way our seams will be hidden inside, and what we'll see is that colored or patterned fabric that's on the inside while we sew. So once you have two pieces cut out, if you want to put a few pins to hold it together while you're sewing, that may be helpful. If that frustrates you because the thread gets caught on the pins, don't use the pins. It's up to you. You can also use a marking pencil or some chalk to trace a line for yourself if you'd like. It will help keep your stitches straight if that's something that you struggle with. We'll be turning this right side out to stuff it, and then we'll need to be able to close it afterward. When you close something and the opening is right up to the corner, that one corner will have a slightly different appearance when you're finished most of the time. So if you can leave your opening in the middle of a side instead of at the corner, that's definitely preferable as far as the finished product is concerned. So I have an example here that I have already sewn, and you can see my stitches are inside the edge of the fabric. If I had gone right at the edge, when I tried to turn this right side out, the fabric would probably pull right through the stitches and I would have a hole that I would have to fix. So it's much more secure to have the stitches set inside the edge. This is about the seam allowance that's typical. Now we're going to look at when you've finished sewing all the way around, and you can see my back stitch, We've tied a knot, which I showed you how to do in the other video. So we're finished. We've sewn it all the way around, leaving ourselves an opening, and you can see I left it in the middle, as I was saying. So the first thing you should do with your fabric shears is to just trim a little bit of the excess seam allowance away if you did sew quite a bit in from the edge. Don't trim too much off where your opening is. You'll want that when it's time to sew it closed. And then the next thing we need to do before we turn this right side out, anytime that you have corners on something that's going to be turned right side out, we need to cut the excess fabric at the corner, because if we didn't, when we turn this right side out, all that fabric would be bunched up in the corner. The corner wouldn't be nice and squared, it would be bunched up and a little rounded, it would be thick there. So to avoid that, we cut each corner off at a 45-degree angle, but we need to be really careful not to cut too close to our stitches. We don't want to accidentally cut the stitches, and we don't want to cut so close that we're going to end up with a hole at the corner. So we're going to cut off all 4 corners, and this 45-degree angle will take care of the bulk of all that extra fabric in the corner and make it look more squared off when we turn it. So now that we've cut our corners off, we can turn this right side out. You don't have to leave yourself a huge opening, just enough to get it to turn. I used contrast color for my thread. My fabric is obviously yellow. I used red thread specifically so that my stitches would stand out better for the video. But if you want your stitches to be more blended in and not show quite so much, you can use a color that matches your fabric better. But if your stitches were short enough and close enough together, you really can't see much here, and that's the objective. So if when you start stuffing your pincushion, or when you turn it right side out, you see all these stretched threads like we do here, because this is where my knot is, so it's a little loose here, but I'm going to end up sewing this closed, so I'll be able to reinforce that. But that's what you would need to do if you had places around the edge where you can see stretched threads like this and the thread is very visible, especially if you used a color that blends in and you can see it anyway. You're going to want to turn it wrong side out again and just reinforce that area. Once you've got it mostly turned out, if you still have some corners that aren't completely squared off, the eraser end of a pencil would work really well for that. And you can just poke the corners so that they square off really nicely. Okay. Before I move on to stuffing this, I want to show you one other thing. If you made something round, either a circular pincushion, maybe something with part that's round, like a heart or something, when we turn this right side out, if you notice, it doesn't look perfectly rounded. It's sort of got a little more of a hexagonal shape to it. And this is because the seam allowance is curved this way, and when we turn this right side out, we're expecting this fabric to curve basically like this, and you can see it's really difficult to make it go that way. It's the opposite of the way it's made. So we need to allow this fabric to stretch so that it will actually form this nice curve that we've sewn. In order to do that, we have to cut some notches into the seam allowance. You're going to need some shears that are nice and sharp at the point so that you don't have to worry about accidentally cutting too far. Like if you're trying to cut with the back of the blade, which is usually what stays the sharpest, you have to be so cautious not to cut too far through the seam allowance and accidentally cut your stitches. And so you can see these points that I'm cutting out come right up to the edge, about 1/8 of an inch away, but I'm not cutting the thread itself, and I don't actually want to cut too close to the thread because I don't want to cut it. So I would just continue like this, clipping my curve, taking all of this seam allowance, giving it the opportunity to stretch and curve when we turn it right side out. You can see that section where I've clipped now has a nice rounded smooth curved edge because of all those little notches that we cut. So whether you have something that had straight sides or curved sides, you'll need to cut some of the seam allowance to make sure that when it's turned right side out, it has the shape that you were expecting. The first thing when you're stuffing is to sort of shred the fluff a little bit, loosen it up, and this will help so that what you're stuffing ends up uniform afterward and you don't have any lumps in it. Stuffing is fairly straightforward, just what you'd pretty much expect. You're stuffing through the opening. This is another time when you'll be very aware of whether or not your stitches were small enough and close enough together, because if you begin to stuff the pincushion and your seam allowance starts to poke out, your stitches start to widen, you start to see fluff coming out through the seam, then you know you have some places you need to go back and reinforce. And again, I used a contrast thread so you could see the stitches, but you can also notice here you only see them just a very little bit, and if this had been a thread that matched the fabric, you would not see this at all. So if you were making a stuffed animal, a pillow, something that you wanted to be soft, obviously you would put less stuffing so that it kept a sort of squishy feeling. So this is fairly squishy still, okay? This is the point where most of you would probably say, okay, I'm done, I've stuffed it, it's finished. You're going to need to stuff this quite a bit more firmly than you probably would expect. We should barely be able to squeeze it at all. If we don't pack this firmly, the pins may not stay when we've poked them in there. Also, it's much more likely they're just going to poke straight through to the other side and poke you. So you're just going to continue to stuff this. If you have a part that's difficult to get to, you can use that eraser end of a pencil again to work the stuffing out into the corners, down into the parts that you're having a difficult time reaching. Okay. So this is pretty good. It's stuffed really firmly, super full. So for me, I like to put a pin here just to help hold this until I get started sewing it closed. For some people, the pins just irritate them and get in their way. So it's a preference thing, depends on what you like. And what I'm going to show you now is a stitch called an invisible stitch. This is how we will close our projects. And the first step is to come up from inside the seam, so my knot will be hidden inside my pincushion. So I'm going to come out back here behind where my original stitches actually stop. So like I said before, we'll be reinforcing this part that's a little bit stretched, so we're not too worried about it. My knot needs to be a little bigger so it won't poke through. You put your needle through the fabric, through the fold, just a small little bite out of the fabric, about 1/8 of an inch. Notice that you're taking a stitch that's parallel to the seam. And then to start your next stitch, you're going to go to the other side of the seam and take a parallel stitch on that side. And as you go along from one side to the other, sticking to those parallel stitches, you'll notice that it starts to draw the two sides of the seam together. Really similar to lacing your shoes, how when you pull the laces tight, the two halves of the shoe draw together. We want to make sure not to get carried away taking too large stitches. That's more likely to make the opening gap. When the pin starts to get in your way, you can just remove it. But the longer your stitches and the further you go away from the last stitch, the more likely you're going to be able to see them. But if you've done this correctly, it should blend really seamlessly with the rest of the seam. When you get to the stitches that are already there, you end the same way you did with your hand sewing. Go through a stitch that's already there. When the loop draws closed, put your needle right through it. Do the same thing in the same spot a couple of times. The way that a lot of people will try to close something is to do what we call a whip stitch. And a whip stitch goes like this. And so you can see I'm going perpendicular to the seam, not parallel. I'm going through the seam instead of next to it. And what happens is it's faster and more effective, for sure. But there is no way to do this without seeing the stitches and seeing a little puckered ridge where you sewed it closed. So certainly I need to trim my knot better, but essentially there is our pincushion. So when you've finished your pincushion, you should send me a picture, several pictures actually, or a video. What I'll be looking for is I want to see all the seams. I want to see where you closed, and it will be easy to tell whether or not it's firm enough just from the thickness of it.